Thank you. My name is Ian Young and I have the very great honour to be Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and whose cultures are amongst the oldest continuing cultures in human history. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the Australian National University. We're pleased to host what is the first of Universities Australia's community forums, an initiative that aims to open the lines of communication between universities and the community. And I hope very much that it'll go further than that it'll sharpen the policy debate around universities and to raise the profile of some of the significant and challenging issues that face our universities today. I'd like to particularly welcome Belinda Robinson, the Chief Executive of Universities Australia, and also my fellow panellists this evening, in no particular order, Kate Carnell, Chief Executive of Beyond Blue and former ACT Chief Minister, Simon Marchison from the Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne, my colleague Stephen Parker, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra, and of course our moderator this evening, Emma Alberici. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Emma, who will explain the format for tonight's proceedings.
Welcome everyone. I am the joint host of Lateline on ABC TV, and we're going to run this a little like my colleague Tony Jones' program Q&A, sitting in his chair, a little bit of a role reversal while he's doing Lateline, which I should be doing this evening. And so what we'll do is I'll open it up to the panellists to answer a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to you. Some of you have already submitted questions, so I will call your names, and I will ask that when I call your names that you actually direct your questions at one or other of the panellists. And I was going to open up by telling you something a little bit about my background when it comes to discussions of the value of university education, and I think it might fall flat because my visual, because being in television pictures paint 1,000 words, but it's going to be so little that I don't know if you're going to be able to see it. But I studied journalism, and that is an interesting debate at the moment because I think there's been a lot of discussion about too many journalism courses, not enough jobs at the end of them. So I think that's something we might touch on this evening as well, about the value from the perspective of relevance to society and jobs at the end. But when I thought about the topic, I studied economics and Italian as well. I studied Italian at Melbourne University and did economics and journalism at Deakin, and they've held me in good stead because I became a finance journalist and then went on to be Europe correspondent, so my language also worked very well. But then I thought about what else did those 4 years give me, and I thought when I was going to show you my visual that I couldn't get up on a big screen, so I don't know if this is really going to... That was me when I entered university that was my high school graduation.
Yes.
And then that was my university.
Yeah.
So I think maybe I found hair straighteners. So handing it over to the panellists. I was going to start, Ian Young, with you. I recently, while we were living in the UK, and I've only just been back a few months from being Europe correspondent, we had an Australian girl, a friend, a daughter of friends of ours, come and stay with us, and she was 18 and doing that obligatory travel before she decides what she's going to do with her life. Her parents, her father is a plumber and her mother has been a stay-at-home mum. And we were sitting around the dining table one evening and talking about what she might do with her life. And she was sort of travelling and doing a little bit of babysitting and working in shops and wherever she could earn some money, and that's what she'd done since she left high school. And I said, what about university? Are you going to think about that when you get back? She said, oh, no. And that was exactly how she reacted. And I said, well, why not? And she said, oh, I'm just not the type. Even my parents don't think I'm the type. And I was stunned. Is that a challenge, do you think, to change perceptions about what university education actually is?
Well, look, I think we know actually that parents' perceptions, what actually happens in the household, is a key influencer on students and what they determine they'll do later on. And so it's not only parents, it's their peers and the whole social group that students actually mix with. And of course, I think anyone who's involved in education of any sort knows that you really don't know what you can achieve until you try. And one of the real challenges I think we've got as a society is to open up those opportunities for students who never think they have the chance. And I think one of the very positive things which this government has done is to actually try and address some of those issues in broadening the access of institutions, both in terms of the number of students who potentially will get a bachelor's degree, but also the socio-economic background of those students. But the answer to your question is yes, we actually not only need to be able to get students when they've finished year 12 and tell them that university is great for them, we need to get them when they're in year 7, 8, 9, and get them to understand then that the sorts of things they do when they finish school will actually shape their whole lives.
And part of the discussion has to be about this issue of perception, about the perception of value as much as it is about the actual value of university education. Stephen Parker, I was going to say that looking at all of this discussion around productivity, that productivity in Australia, we all know, has been kind of stalled for at least 10 years. There's been virtually no productivity growth. How much of that do you think is or can we say that appears to be at least an indictment on the university sector? Because other than training people to go into mining, isn't it your jobs to actually lift the rest of the community into somewhere else?
Well, I think we're part of it, and we're definitely an important part of the community, but I think that the issues about national productivity in Australia, but in the Western world generally, are much more complex than that. One of the ways of addressing productivity problems, I think, is to educate more people to the highest levels, probably geared in the science, technology, mathematics area more than we've done in the past. But I would have thought education is the answer to our productivity issues rather than the cause of it.
Well, if it is the answer, well, why hasn't it worked? So why haven't you been achieving that?
Well, I think the logic of the Bradley reforms in the higher education sector and the logic of the current government policy to expand participation and attainment is attributable to productivity concerns. I think that's fundamentally what's driving it. And if you look at the convergence between the so-called Western world and the so-called Third World, which is now taking place, by the year 2030, over half the world's output, economic output, will be coming from what we have in the past called the Third World. This is going to be a real challenge for countries like Australia. And if you add in the demographic challenges that we face, I don't know if anyone's read Bernard Salt's book, The Big Tilt, but we have more baby boomers retiring now than we have young people entering the workforce to replace them. I think Australia has got a massive problem looming over the next 10 to 20 years, and universities are part of the answer, or tertiary education is part of the answer.
Did you want to add something?
I'd just like to take you on that a bit. We do have now more university graduates as a percentage of our population than we've ever had before. We've got more students at university than ever before. And yet Australia's productivity hasn't just stalled in comparison to other OECD countries of similar sorts. We've actually gone down. And as well, where we are on the innovation scale in the OECD is really right down near the bottom. So something's not going right, is it? For Australia and for universities in this space.
I mean, I think universities are part of the whole issue. And I think universities need to reform themselves and need to think about productivity as well. But we're only part of the issue. Yeah. I mean, at the recent Universities Australia conference in March in Canberra, one of the invited speakers was Michael Wesley from the Lowy Institute. And he talked about the hunger that there is for productivity, for growth, for development in large parts of the world, whereas countries like Australia, frankly, I think are coasting. Yeah. We're assuming that it is the golden age, and it probably is the golden age at the moment, but it won't last. Mm-hmm. So I think we all have a big wake-up call, and universities are part of that, but I don't see us as being a particular cause of the problem.
Just pick you up on what you were saying before about the challenges going forward and heading into 2030. Now, you said that by then 50% of the world's output will come from the developing, what we now see as the developing world. And I guess to actually be able to put that into some sort of context, at the moment it's about 30% versus 70% in the West at the moment?
Well, it has changed over time, but at its peak, the West had something like 26% of the world's population and produced 73% of the world's economic output, which is why we've been comfortable, it's why we've been affluent. But that gap is closing. Now, that's fine if it's just the rest of the world catching up and we get an equalisation. But I think there's an absolute decline going on in the West as well. And if you look at some of the huge countries that are developing, the amount that they're throwing into economic development, into universities, into tertiary education, we are going to look very sorry in 10 or 20 years unless we invest now. So I guess my key message is this may be the golden age now, but we don't have a moment to lose, and we need to invest in our tertiary education if we're going to be competitive in a much changed world in 20 years' time.
Can I throw just a couple of figures in on that, just because I chair the CRC for forestry. And this year we'll graduate 20 foresters in Australia, and China will graduate 128,000. I've just recently finished with Food and Grocery Council. We'll graduate something under 50 food technologists, and China will graduate 350,000. Aren't they extraordinary figures, just in terms of the difference?
Absolutely, and Simon Marginson is an educator. He's Professor of Higher Education at Melbourne University. We were just discussing before we opened this up to the floor about the kinds of students he's seeing, because they're doctorate students, aren't they, generally? And we were going through, I asked him how many of his graduates actually worked in government in Australia, because if you're going to affect change, imagine the place to do that is from within government. And it was a bit sad, your answer.
Well, not many are going to work in government in Australia, and I think that a lot of our brightest students in Australia don't go to government. They go to business and they go to the professions. It's different in Asia. One of the things that drives the East Asian economies is the quality of government itself, is the strategic coordination of infrastructure investment, education and training and research, city development, city design, by highly competent state machines. And perhaps they might be better than ours now in some ways. When you go to a place like Tokyo or Shanghai or Hong Kong, you realise what superb transport systems they've devised successfully and implemented and run efficiently, cheaply, and in a way that moves the whole population around in a highly productive way. We don't seem to be able to do that kind of thing. Some of my students are going to go back into Asian countries and work in government. It's seen as a highly honourable thing to do, it's a high status thing to do, and it's a relatively well-paid thing to do. And I think it's a good sign that good quality students are still coming to Australia, to places like the ANU and University of Melbourne, University of Canberra, and doing their postgraduate training in Australia. It means we do have some expertise to offer. We have professional training expertise, we have research expertise. But of course, those graduates are going to go back to Asia. I think it's all about Asia, and I think Stephen's really hit on the main argument that we need to make in Australia about Australian universities. Certainly, Asian universities, East Asian universities and Singaporean universities in particular, are moving past us in a lot of ways in competence. They haven't passed us yet as a group, but they are beginning to move past us. And with the level of investment they're receiving, there's every sign that they will do better than us unless we move quite quickly to catch up again. But also, I think Asia is the place where a lot of Australian high-quality services, Australian business will find its opportunities as well. Our domestic market can't carry our economic development. We need to look to exports, not only of primary produce, but of services like education, where we do export successfully on a large scale at the moment, but also financial services, health services, city design, those kinds of things. And we need to be looking for business opportunities in those areas. And to do that, of course, we'll need to develop Asian language competence and cultural knowledge.
I think at the moment, and I'm just going to stay with you for a minute and just tell the audience a little bit more about you for those who don't necessarily know. I was just listing these before, and it's just to give you some perspective of where Simon Marginson comes from in this debate, because he has a very international focus. In 2009, he was a visiting professor at Hiroshima University in Japan. He's an honorary fellow of the UK Society for Research into Higher Education. He's a member of the National University of Mexico, and advisory roles at Peking University, Graduate School of Education and the University of Tokyo. He's active in the Association for Studies in Higher Education in the US, and so on and so forth. And he's prepared commissioned reports for the OECD, the European Commission, the governments of Malaysia, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Netherlands and Ireland. So that's why I'm very interested in his international perspective. We all know that people from all over the world want to study at Cambridge, at Yale, at Harvard, at Oxford. What are the attitudes to Melbourne University, Sydney University, the ANU? What do people overseas think about those universities?
I don't think any of our universities are household names in the way that Harvard or Oxford are. There's probably only a couple of dozen universities in the world that can command that kind of respect, global respect. And I suspect Peking University and Tsinghua in China are going to join that list. But really, most of those universities are in the Atlantic countries. Stanford as well, UCLA in California and so on. I think the Australian National University is, amongst those who know about education and research, a well-known institution outside Australia. An institution which, because of its research role and reputation, engenders a lot of respect. And that's because ANU was founded principally as a research university in a way which the other universities in Australia were not. They had earliest colonial beginnings, and they began as finishing schools for the colonial middle class. Melbourne, Sydney, University of Queensland, University of Western Australia, they're also universities which have currency offshore, and others as well. I mean, I think you see some universities now emerging as universities which trigger recognition outside Australia. Griffith, Queensland University of Technology, University of Technology Sydney, Curtin University in Western Australia. Places like that are now better known than they were even 5 or 10 years ago. But I don't think we can expect that Australian universities will ever carry a huge global reputation while Australia remains a middle power. And our best option is to develop a strong reputation nationally overall for the quality of our education and research. And I guess if you look at the export numbers, if you look at the number of students who come to Australia and access our education services, there are good signs. I mean, we more than 20% of our students are foreign students. That's the highest percentage in the world. We take in about 300,000 foreign students into our universities. That's, after the US and the UK, now the third largest number in the world. Most of those students are from Asia. I think, though, that we don't get enough of the very, very brightest students. We don't get enough of the students who go to Oxford and Cambridge on lucrative scholarships because we're not offering enough in terms of incentives to the very brightest students. The scholarships are a market of a kind, and students go where they can get the best support. If they can go to a place where they can get their living allowance paid for as well as their tuition, they'll go there. If they can go to a place where their family's school fees will be paid, they'll go there. And if they can go to a place where they'll get a living allowance on top of that, they'll go there. And they can get those sorts of supports in the US, where there's lots of philanthropic and university money there to support that kind of activity. Our universities currently, on their own resources, can't mount that kind of attraction, that kind of scholarship effort. We really need Commonwealth help in that area, I think.
Kay Carnell, do you think it's about Commonwealth or state support, or should universities be seeking money elsewhere?
I think it's absolutely essential that universities seek money elsewhere. I think if we just have a look for a moment back to, look, PhDs. Let's compare Australia with other OECD countries in terms of where PhD students work. Australia predominantly work in the academic sector. They go into universities and so on. In the US, by far the majority is going to industry. In fact, Australia is the fourth lowest, along with Greece and Portugal, which have economies that we don't aspire to at this stage. So I think when we look at collaboration with business, with industry generally, at the universities, in the university sector generally, is pretty important. And I think there's a trust issue. I really do.
In what sense?
I don't think universities, particularly in the research space, naturally in Australia work closely with industry. And I don't and probably that's, that CRCs have worked quite well, there's no doubt about that, but they're a little bit outside the university sector. I think there's, for whatever reason, I just don't think I think the trust between business and universities is high. Fine to take money from business, take it and go away and do whatever you like. But I'm talking about real collaboration here.
Is there, Ian Young, that sort of collaboration? Do business come to you and say, actually, this is the research we want you to do? Or do you go to them and say, this is the research we want to do, give us the money to do it?
Look, I think there's a bit of both. I mean, I think one of the challenges Australia has are the sorts of industries that we have.
Yep.
I mean, we don't have the large multinationals headquartered in Australia that make these major investments. So we tend to have either small and medium-sized enterprises which tend not to invest in research. They might be interested in development but not research. Or we tend to have the branch offices of the multinationals that, again, tend to do the work at home rather than here. So I think there are a few challenges around that. But this whole issue of funding is actually critically important, and it drives all of these things, because without funding you can't deliver the quality. Without the quality you can't develop the reputation. Without the reputation you don't attract the students. So there's this virtuous spiral around all of these things. And so universities, I don't think, essentially if you want to aspire to the sorts of institutions that Simon was talking about at that elite level, government's not going to be able to provide the resources you need to be able to do that. You're going to have to find other broader sources for that funding, and whether it be, and I think the reality is it's not one source. It will be industry when it's appropriate to be that. It will be philanthropic donations when you can actually develop that. It will be government when they have the resources to be able to invest. But it's going to be, I think there's a range of things that would make it very challenging for Australia's universities to be able to compete on the sorts of levels that Simon was talking about.
You were talking about, sorry, just to follow this thing for one moment. You were talking about the fact that we don't have too many multinationals headquartered here. Well, we have a lot of enormous mining companies
Yes.
in Australia, and they are obviously the engine room for our economy at the moment. How many alliances are there between universities and mining companies?
Well, I think reasonably. I mean, if you actually looked at if you look at the two industries that I would immediately pick, where Australia probably leads the world in terms of the technology that you have, it would be agriculture and mining.
That's right.
And they're Australia's two biggest industries, essentially, in that sense. And so, where we have actually had that critical mass, where we actually have the big players, then I think Australian science and technology has stepped forward.
And is that university driven,
Yes, it
or
is.
is that driven within the actual companies?
Oh, some of each.
Both.
I mean, it's both. I mean, companies will outsource research where it's appropriate to do it. They'll bring it in-house when they think it's profitable and there are confidentiality reasons they want to do it.
Could there be more of that?
Oh,
Coming to the universities, I mean.
well, look, it's not you can't. It's pointless for me to sit here and blame the industry. There's issues on both sides. Can we be more accommodating and open for industries? Certainly we can. We need to make sure that we still keep to our ethos and values, and we continue to develop basic research as well. But my observation is that basic research and applied research are not enemies; they're partners. And the industry knows where there's quality. They actually go to quality institutions where there's good basic research to invest. So I don't see any challenges between the fundamental basic research that institutions would want to do, but also being able to turn that into practical things that industry values.
Can I add to this? I've just completed 3 case studies of 3 different countries looking at the relationship between university research and private sector activity, private sector research and private sector innovation on the basis of research. We looked at Australia, then we went to the Netherlands, which is a country of similar size, slightly smaller in population, where there are a lot of public-private research-based partnerships, and there's very large multinationals like Philips and Shell that are headquartered there and draw on local research a lot. And we looked at Korea, where there's even more public-private activity, where the universities feed into a number of industry sectors in a very lively way, and there's also a large CSIRO type apparatus of research institutes which plays that feeding of industry role as well. And what we found was that Australia was very different to the other 2 cases. And what the situation here is that our industry profile is much thinner. We've quite rightly focused on mining and agriculture as the areas where we have highly competent, cutting-edge companies doing research-based product development using local research. CSIRO plays an immense role, the universities play an immense role in relation to agriculture. We looked at University of Western Australia in Curtin, who were feeding the petroleum and extraction industries heavily with research knowledge in Western Australia, and we're doing work directly to the industry. There was no barriers, there were no problems. The industry was very happy with what they were receiving as research services. But agriculture and mining are not enough to create a complete public-private research relationship of the kind which Kate, I think, quite rightly pointed us towards. And the problem is manufacturing in Australia. We don't have many large-scale manufacturers. Our SME sector, it's a problem all over the world getting SME sectors research-based, but our SME sectors have particular difficulties with that. I mean, I think we've spent 20 years at government level and in the universities and in the business organisations trying to get a better fit between research and in universities and industry take-up and innovation. My sense of the problem is that once you leave aside our strong industry sectors, which are carrying the economy, of course, in many ways, the universities have the capacity to feed the private sector. The private sector demand isn't there. And it's that we need to look at.
Can I just bring up an example where possibly we just missed the boat in Australia? The world's biggest food manufacturing company, Nestle, which has a very, very strong research base. They have 150 PhDs just in their Swiss research operation. A couple of years ago, we're looking at setting up their R&D centre for the Asia-Pacific area. Looked to Australia and a range of other places and went to Singapore because the Singapore government really wanted them. Now, Singapore has a tiny little place. It doesn't have any agriculture, and most food manufacturing comes from, things that you grow or whatever. I mean, there's no logic for them to be in Singapore, except the government decided they wanted them. And I think sometimes we miss the boat there, and Nestle were willing and did invest a huge amount of money in an area, well, let's be fair, food production, food R&D in this whole Asia-Pacific region, and taking into account food and grocery is the biggest manufacturing industry in Australia.
It should
we
be
should have got
us.
it,
Yeah, we should.
but we didn't.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit of a,
And who do you blame for that?
Oh look,
Or
I
what
think,
do you blame for that?
I think an attitude, an Australian just attitude.
In government or?
Well, all the way. I mean, maybe it's all of us. The fact is that they pitched to government and nobody particularly showed an interest, whereas other governments did.
Is that a problem of the university sector also, that your tertiary education sector, that you're not doing a good enough lobbying job to account to government for the jobs that you do? The value, I mean, we're talking here about the value of university education. You're kind of preaching to the converted here. Is the job not being done well enough in that to state governments, to federal government?
Well, I'm sure we can do better. We do a lot of lobbying, but I think the real challenge at the moment is to bring public opinion around in support of universities. And I'm not saying that public opinion is against universities. And, if you ask people, do you like the idea of universities, they're bound almost all to say yes. But would it change their vote as between two political parties if there were big differences? I don't think so. So I think the challenge of the sector and Universities Australia is actually to appeal beyond government, but to public opinion, to persuade people that the future of Australia lies in its tertiary education. We are sunk, we are lost without being at the cutting edge of tertiary education.
And knowledge nation, as
absolutely.
As some used to
Not
say.
only knowledge, but creativity, innovation, the skill sets that people are going to need in order for Australia to be competitive in the future. So I see this agenda, and including tonight's inaugural event, as a start of an engagement with the community to bring public opinion around, not specifically government opinion.
Now, sorry.
The key is long-term thinking. That's what's missing in Australia, in government and in politics. I mean, we're hypnotised by it used to be the 3-year electoral cycle. It now seems to be the week's news.
We're in a constant election cycle at the moment with the minority government.
Yeah, and you go from pole to pole, and that's the attention span. But what's noticeable about China, Singapore, Hong Kong, SAR, Japan always, Korea, is that they have long-term view. And they have a long-term view not only in government, where the bureaucrats stay forever, regardless of who's in office. But they have a long-term view in the community, in the society, and in the discussion, in the big multinational enterprises. There's the same kind of investment horizon. I mean, our problem, I think, in higher ed is that we are an investment sector. It's all about the future. It's hard to demonstrate the product in the present because it is about the future, and the benefits will show over time. That's true of education as well as research, because the effects of education are lifelong. I mean, they're not about the first job, it's about the life and the career. And research, certainly, the horizons are 5, 10, 15 years ahead. We need to develop a space in Australia that permits investment in infrastructure and in education, which are long-term in their effects.
Okay.
And Emma, can I say one? I think I absolutely agree with Simon, and I think now is actually a really interesting time in Australia's history. I mean, okay, we know about the two-speed economy, the mining boom, the high Australian dollar, although it's dropping a bit at the moment. But the real concern I have is, because of some of those things, you're seeing what manufacturing we have disappear at an alarmingly rapid rate. My great concern is that at the moment we sit back and say, well, it's okay, the agriculture to some extent and the mining will carry us through. But I can see 5 or 6 years' time when the mining boom ends, us not having mining, manufacturing will have been completely destroyed. Yeah. We'll have nothing left. And so you sort of say, well, what's the future? Well, the future's got to be for Australia to actually develop manufacturing industries which are niche manufacturing industries.
Well, actually, Stephen Parker, you've got something to say about this, because you wrote recently that Australia, quote, can be a manufacturing country again.
Yeah, referring partly to the kinds of things that Ian was talking about, but if you look at what I understand to be the third industrial revolution, additive manufacturing, the developments from 3D printing technologies, so that products will be made much nearer the place where they're going to be used, and where the real value is going to be in the technology and in the design rather than in the manufacturing process itself. Australia and countries like Australia can be back in the manufacturing game for the next industrial revolution. But for that, we need highly educated populations who are creative, technologically minded, mathematically gifted, and so forth. And I'm not sure that we're even talking about what we need in the next generation of Australians in order to be equipped for the next industrial revolution.
I'm going to open it up to the audience now, and I'm looking for Julia Wee. And if you could stand up and tell us who your question's directed to.
I actually didn't realise I'd have to get to recite my question out, so would you be happy with you?
Well, no, you just tell us what you want to know.
Well, oh, fantastic. As a result of the Dawkins reforms, universities are today the sometimes unhappy marriage of universities of olden days and other further education institutes like conservatoriums, institutes of technology and art schools. I've been an administrator for close to a decade in the university sector, and I've witnessed firsthand at coalface the financial pressure placed on those disciplines that do not attract funding easily and are costly to undertake, like Blue Skies research in the physical sciences, or as we've seen lately, Vice-Chancellor Young, the School of Music here at the ANU. Yet I believe the wider community still values such activities and views these endeavours as worthwhile in their own right. Should universities discontinue such activities where they seem financially unviable, and at what threshold should these activities be discontinued? Shouldn't universities move to a kind of triple-line accounting so that non-financial costs, for example, loss of competency skills in Asian languages, can be accounted for? And I address the entire panel because it's not just about the ANU, it's about the sector as a whole.
Yeah. No, look, a very good question. I think one of the real challenges we face on a daily basis within universities. The answer to your question is I think all universities make strategic decisions exactly along those lines. And so if I take ANU as an example, there are a range of areas where we do this, and there are 3 that immediately come to mind where ANU explicitly in its budget has said we will actually cross-subsidise areas. And surprisingly, one of them is music, another one is art, and the third one is Asian languages. And we've chosen those 3 we didn't just do it by accident, we chose them for very good reasons. The first one is that the current funding models simply don't work for those particular areas, the way they're funded. The second one was that in the case of both art and music, as Australia's national university, we didn't think that they were national issues because they're provided elsewhere, but we thought they were important local issues here in Canberra, so we actually provided explicit subsidies for those. In the case of Asian languages, ANU has a very important role to play as the national university in fostering and preserving Asian languages, and so we take that as a very important part of our mission. Of course, there's a limit to how you can do that, because every time you move resources from, you want to subsidise something, then you have to take the resources from somewhere else. And particularly when we have a funding system which is driven on per student dollars, when you do that, you're saying to the student who is in the first year Bachelor of Arts class of 350, we're going to take some of the resources from your program and put it into another program. So there are no easy answers to the problem you ask.
Just to add something there. I agree entirely that all organisations probably cross-subsidise activities in some senses. That's what makes them an organisation. The question, Julia, you used the word threshold. I think that's the issue. How many cross-subsidised activities can you maintain, and is that threshold changing? And I think the threshold probably is changing, because we're moving into a demand-driven environment. We have to, I'm now descending into cliches, we have to play to our strengths, and to the extent that we spend money on activities which don't cover their costs, we're taking money away from something that's a potential strength which might help build the organisation. So demand-driven funding hasn't actually arisen yet in the discussion, but it might do from now on. I'm not a particular supporter of it, but I can say that it's changing the rationality within universities all around the country. And the kinds of controversies that you've heard about in Canberra, obviously there was music, but in our case, Japanese has only just had a reprieve in the University of Canberra. And there will be all around the country episodes like this, as we keep trying to juggle with where is the threshold for cross-subsidisation, where are we going to put our money so that we can build strengths as well.
Can I add something though, just from a business perspective? In my previous role with the Food and Grocery Council, we couldn't get enough graduates or enough focus on food technology across Australian universities. So the industry came to the party and funded, or at least joint funded, a chair of food science that went out to expressions of interest at a number of universities. Queensland Uni got up. So there's a joint funded chair, and there's more of that happening. A couple of mining companies are doing that as well, and I don't think it's such a bad way to go if there's a need but there's not the students yet. Because it's a bit of a cyclic thing, isn't it? If you don't have the students, you don't have the money, so...
And if I get a second bite of the cherry, I mean, I agree entirely, Kate, but something that I think Stephen said is really important. You do need to play to your strengths, and one of the problems I think we have in our system at the present time is the funding system for Australian universities tends to drive us all to look the same. Yes. We all have big business faculties because there's dollars there, and we all want to invest in medical research because we get big research returns for that, and it pushes our rankings up. But that's not a logical way to actually develop the higher education system. What you really want is to be able to focus, to be able to say, this institution has a particular mission which is its mission, and it needs to be able to develop that, and others to be able to play to their strengths as well. But we don't have a funding system which allows us to do that.
I have a question that's actually I don't know the answer. When I studied at Deakin, you went there to study journalism, architecture and nutrition, and they were sort of the only things you did. I understand now that that's become a much bigger university. It's taken over campuses in Melbourne, and it's become probably a bit more everything for everybody. Should we be going more back to universities that you go to for those single focus disciplines?
Well, my view is, I'm sure my colleagues have, my view is we should be. I mean, it's a logical way for this country to actually spend its tax dollars and to invest in institutions. But you need a different sort of funding system, different policy drivers to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, and Stephen also has been very active in this discussion as well in promoting the idea of differentiation and diversity. A lot of us feel this, that we need to find ways of modelling the system so that there can be a broad range of kinds of institution in it. other countries are able to do this. They do this by establishing classifications of different kinds of institutions and then funding them and managing their missions differently according to what classification the institutions are in. So you get the large comprehensive research universities with medical faculties are one category. You get specialist institutions that focus on areas like business or the arts. It never made much sense in Australia, for example, why we had to fold in the film and television schools and the conservatoriums of music in the States into larger universities. The only reason we did this was because there was an edict which said unless you were over 5,000 students, you couldn't get full funding. And so, which was simply a way of eliminating small institutions. They were inefficient. They did need to be modernised, but it's possible to run a small institution effectively. And of course, it's a better way to run it according to mission if it has a specialist function. So we need to get away from the single pot of money, the uniform drivers, the common template, all institutions trying to imitate the comprehensive research university because that's where the dollars are, that's where the status is and so on, that's where the international students will come. But to do that we need a more complex and more nuanced policy framework in which government makes some hard decisions about priorities and about where specialisation should occur.
I'm going to ask Timothy Boston to ask the next question. Do we have Timothy Boston here? No. Okay. What about, I've got a few more here. Sarah Pearson. There we go.
So it's great to hear you talk about strategy. Oh, thank you much. About strategy and thinking about how universities can be helping a nation, growing a nation, and thinking through where we can specialise, where our key benefits are, where our key capabilities are, and so how we can be really driving the nation forwards. And one of those areas internationally is around industrialisation. So you mentioned earlier about helping our manufacturing base, and globally people are looking to universities to really help drive that manufacturing base. I wanted to see if you could expand on that a bit more, but also not just stick with the technologies, which is really the science and technology is a lot of what we've been discussing here, but I think there's a lot of added value that we can give way beyond the technologies. For instance, in the mining sector, we help people with their livelihoods in Papua New Guinea when mining companies are in there. So there are a whole range of ways that we can help. I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that. And start with you, Simon.
You're a bit unlucky, Sarah, because we've had a long discussion about the issues which your question was about. And they were about the role of universities in relation to innovation and how we might measure or understand that. And you made the point, I think, in your original question that we received in writing before the discussion, that we should look at engagement with industry as a measure. And I think that's right. I mean, I think we're beginning to think harder now about how we might develop comparable metrics on engagement, not only with industry and business, but also with community, with local government, and with other large organisations. And we also are, some of us, moving towards devising methods of measuring engagement with the general public on a one-to-one basis as well. I think we do need to start recording and comparing and improving on those kinds of metrics as a way of driving more engagement. But I think with industry, a lot of it does depend on establishing the right kind of public climate. We need to be discussing publicly in the media much more the creation and the pursuit of those relationships. We need to be talking about specific industries and what universities are doing already. A lot of that's not news and not discussed and should be discussed.
What are they doing?
My colleagues will...
What's your university doing?
Oh.
Well, you say that
it's a
the
long
media.
story.
Well, you say the media needs to be discussing it. Well, we need a good story.
No, not a criticism. I think it's what we bring to you.
I'm just saying.
I think it's what we bring to the media. The University of Melbourne, like all large universities, employs a considerable number of people now in public communication. They would provide you with an extensive list of activities.
Okay, we'll leave you on that one for the minute.
So,
University of Canberra, what is it doing?
So, unlike the group of 8 representatives, I didn't get a copy of your question beforehand. But I would I'd add maybe one element to this, and this is about design as well. So when we're thinking about manufacturing and technology in the future, these have got to be beautifully and efficiently designed. And I don't think Australia puts enough emphasis on design values. I was in China not too long ago and talking to a university president. He said at the moment the label is made in China, but what we want is designed in China. And the value and the creativity and the growth is going to come around these added elements and not just the making. And I think Australia should be more proud of its design, should invest more. And I can say that the University of Canberra is doing that, and we're very proud of our industrial design.
Can I say though, just from an industry perspective more, and Beyond Blue funds, well this year will fund about $5 million worth of research. Most of that is in some level of cooperation with universities, well, certainly with researchers. But some of the dilemmas for industry is that how universities determine what success is and what industry does are often somewhat at odds with each other, because industry actually doesn't care if anyone publishes. And that seems to be at times all universities do care about. So come on, you guys.
Well,
it's
that's
a
a good
real
point,
problem.
isn't it? I mean, one of the problems we have with there are many issues in university rankings, as any vice chancellor will tell you, and one of the issues is that they measure impact as impact in the academic literature, which is easy to count, of course, because you can identify who's citing what article. They don't measure impact on the community, in business, in industry, on the economy, and it's one of the frontiers of knowledge in this area is to devise useful measures. Across which will work across regions, across countries, in terms of comparison, and over time, of impact on industry. It's a very important issue.
But
something Ian Chubb is thinking about as chief scientist.
But there has to be some genuine engagement. What sort of engagement does the ANU take part in the community?
Well, I mean, I think the interactions with industry you've mentioned, I mean, I could pick a whole range of those, whether it's around solar energy or it's our issues in the environment. But I actually think that we always tend to, and I think this is the core of Sarah's question, we always tend to jump back to technology solutions. That's how you interact with industry. And to some extent, I suspect that for Australia, there may be a number of other opportunities. We keep hearing about this being the Asian century, and if you look at those developing Asian countries, in many cases we're not going to have a technology solution for them. They can actually do the microprocessing, all those things cheaper than we can do it, and probably more efficiently than we can do it. I think some of the services we're going to be able to sell in the future are going to be things which are coming out of the social sciences, because as those countries mature, they start to become concerned about a whole range of social issues, and a developed Western country like Australia actually has a whole host of things that it can actually provide in that area. So I think they're not going to be manufacturing plants, but I think there's a whole range of new industries that Australia can develop, which are coming out of the humanities and social sciences will be really important.
But you need then to be focusing, that we need to work out how we focus a little bit more on translation. Yeah. Research rather than we have to get the balance in research between primary research and translation right in the social science arena, as that's the sort of research that Beyond Blue is most interested in. But it's still a dilemma when at the CRC level, when we've got one particular university saying, well, look, we don't know that we should be becoming involved in these CRCs because there's just our researchers aren't publishing enough. They're getting these things called patents, but hey, we need those published articles. Well, I understand why you're going down that path, but I still don't get what's going to change it.
Is there too much competition among Australian universities for the same prize, if you like? So are you all trying to be the best at this niche bit of medical research and this other sort of thing, rather than sort of deciding that this university is going to be great at this and this one's going to be great at that, so that you can channel the money much more effectively throughout the country, being a small population, kind of relatively small player as it is?
Well, yes, it's a simple answer to that
But
question.
why isn't that happening?
Because, well, I mean, this was saying before.
It goes back to the funding
It's the
structure.
funding model. I mean, you have a funding model which drives us to do these things. And until you break that nexus, then we all want to look the same.
Do we have Colin Steele here?
Yep, sure do. I think that then feeds right into the question I'm going to ask, because it comes into the community aspects and the wider aspects of impact in the social science, humanities and science and medicine. So the question is, what should Australian universities be doing to ensure publicly funded research is accessible beyond the subscription firewalls of multinational publishers? And I think Simon's probably the best one to come in first.
Colin, you know more about this than I do, and I'm sure you'd answer your own question extremely well. And we are, in fact, many of us guided by your thinking about this. We're in the situation where the internet has made available an enormous wealth of knowledge that wasn't previously available instantly. And the amount of research that's now available directly through the internet is phenomenal, but a large proportion of academic publishing in English is owned, in effect, by a small number of publishers who are able to charge what they like in terms of access to that information. And they have to hold a balance between providing a service which everyone wants to participate in and making money, of course, but they perhaps err on the side of making money rather than providing access. This is, of course, anomalous when you're looking at publicly funded agencies funding research and then that research not being instantly accessible to any member of the public. That's not right. The issue is not just an Australian issue, it's a world issue, and the major universities in the US, which is a country which likes the market, generally speaking, nonetheless hold to the view, or many of them do, that there should be public access, there should be free public access, not only to research but also to courseware and other forms of important information that universities generate. And I think my sense is that the open access movement is gaining ground, that Harvard in particular has been able to lead a movement which is beginning to, I guess, pull the rug out from under the publishing monopoly. Perhaps the short answer to your question is to say universities could instruct their staff to make available all of their research results. I won't say just their publicly funded research, because they're all employed by public institutions, whatever research they're doing. They should make available all of their publicly funded research through free distribution media. Exactly how you do that is another question, whether you use the PDFs of the journal articles or some other version of the same information is one of the issues, the practical issues. But all those data should be available now.
Colin, whoever thought up the model for the publishers has to be an absolute genius. This is a business model no one could ever think would work. Universities actually spend money to develop the research. Our research is then handed over to the publishing company free of charge, and in many cases actually pay the publishers through page charges. They then sell it back to us to put in our library. Who in their right mind would sign up to that? But we have.
I think this is definitely an idea whose time has come. It's effectively a heist that we're seeing going on, and it is definitely time for us to strike back. And I think the disruptive technology of the internet is going to enable us to do this. And I think it's the kind of thing that universities collectively should be having a conversation about. It simply can't go on.
Okay, there are two questions that are very similar. I'll ask, is it Louis Klee? Louis Klee? No? Or Dennis Alexander?
I'm actually going to change my question a little bit, but with the same intent. Essentially, the preamble goes, the business model is the dominant metaphor in today's society and in today's discourse. So we talk about profits, we talk about technologies, we talk about productivity, and those concepts and metaphors are applied to universities. But I thought we would ask Kate, as a representative of business, are universities just another business? How much do we really know about the Vice-Chancellor as a CEO? And do you think the mainstream Australia really does understand research and education?
I think everyone should answer that, but I hate the word "just another business." Look. What is a business? A business is an entity that you decide what you want to do, you invest in it, and you attempt to achieve particular outcomes as a result of it. There are lots of not-for-profit businesses. Beyond Blue that I run would be one of those. So from that perspective, if you define a business that way, that's exactly what a university does. It gets, it has inputs, it gets dollars from various places, it has a very definite focus on what it's going to do with those dollars, and it delivers a product or a set of products based upon that goal. It's not, the issues surrounding profit, I don't think are an issue in that space. So I don't think business is a bad word at all. I think it's a good word if you look at it as something that you get a return on your investment, and I think that universities see life through that prism. That return may not be dollars, it might be a range of other things, but we certainly should get that return. And do people really understand the space? No, out there in public land. But go for it, you guys.
Yeah, well, I think this is an important sort of issue in a way, and some of us go back far enough to remember when complex social organisations weren't defined in terms of business models, which is, I suppose, pre-1985 or 80. What you've seen is a worldwide trend, not just English-speaking countries, not just neoliberal polities, but really worldwide trend, right across the whole government sector, the NGO sector, the all kinds of non-profit activity, to model organisation in terms of a common template. And you could call that template the quasi-firm, because it's not exactly a business firm, but it resembles many of the features. It carries many of the features of a business firm. And the common language which all organisations now use, KPIs and bottom lines and so on. So the problem that this has created is that the business model works very well for organisations which work according to a business logic. But there are maybe half a dozen other kinds of organisations, from sporting clubs to churches to universities and so on, which have different logics. They have different kinds of products, perhaps. They have different kinds of expectations and cultures and activities. So that when you use the quasi-firm template to talk about those organisations, you have to add back in the specific features that they have which don't fit the business model to make sure those things get looked after. Now, I think this is the kind of ongoing calculation which a Vice-Chancellor carries in her or his head on a daily basis. That they're always thinking about the things they have to add back in to the model to make a decision that works in the university context. And of course, universities aren't run according to a simple quasi-firm logic. But a lot of the language we use is of that kind. That leads to, unless we're very careful, it leads to under-recognition of certain objectives. What you might call public goods or community or collective goods inside the organisation tend to be under-recognised unless we make a determined effort to focus on them and bring them back in. Maybe in 30 years' time we won't be using this quasi-firm model for everything. We'll have half a dozen different templates that we would apply differentially according to what sector of society we're talking about. Right now we're stuck with it, and we have to be quite vigilant, I think, to make sure that the right values and the right objectives do get recognised in our decision making.
Ian Young, I think that just going back to Julia Wee's question, actually, which I don't think we quite answered the premise of the question, which was how do we account for those non-financial benefits that accrue from certain fields of study, like the School of Music, parts of the curriculum that are not necessarily well funded?
Well, I think it's also at the core of the question that Dennis was asking about universities as businesses. And I think that, I don't shy away from that. No, I think we are businesses. We're knowledge businesses. And I think the difference between a university, however, and particularly a for-profit business, is that it's much more difficult to measure your outputs. So if we were a for-profit business, then the biggest KPI would be profit. And our stakeholders would be really clear, the shareholders. In the case of a university, then look at the ANU's strategic plan. We've got pages and pages of KPIs. because we're trying to do exactly these things. We're trying to actually excel in research. We're trying to actually demonstrate how we meet our student outcomes. So we have a broad range of KPIs. And I think that's the answer to this question. We've got many of these things that we're trying to define it, to deliver on at the same time. And similarly, we're not really sure who our stakeholders are either. There's a whole bunch of them. They're our students, they're our research partners, they're government, they're the parents of our students, they're governments, they're local governments. So we're trying to also satisfy the needs of a whole range of different people who legitimately think they've got a stake in what the organisation does.
Like the
So-
ABC.
Hey. That's a whole other hour of discussion. So just to pick you up on that, what do you see as the Vice-Chancellor of the ANU, what do you see as your key measure of success? Is it the number of jobs that your graduates, or the types of jobs that your graduates attain, or what, how do you measure it?
Well, as I said, I've got 20 or 30 KPIs.
But what is it?
Okay, look. In the case of ANU, what will people remember? They'll remember where our research ranking was.
Yes, I was going to say that.
And that's
That's on the number
which
of
doesn't.
articles that get published.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, that's
Sure.
I mean, that's the truth. I mean, I could say lots of other things, but in the case of this university, that's what people will remember.
That's right.
Which doesn't mean the other things we do are not important. They are important. I mean, the fact that we actually educate a whole lot of incredibly gifted young people, and that they have very important careers after that, and we change their lives. That's why people are in universities. But if you asked for what would be the one thing that this institution would be measured for, it's its research position.
And does that explain why something like the School of Music becomes at risk because there's no research attached to it?
Well, there is research attached to it. In fact, one of the things we're trying to do as we actually... by the way, the School of Music's not under threat. What we're trying to do with the School of Music is actually put it on a sound model, and indeed one of the things which comes out of the feedback is that particularly postgraduate students are saying what you need to do is you actually need to have a curriculum which builds better pathways to postgraduate research. So music is actually an area where you can actually be research active and do all those sorts of things. So the fact that it's a School of Music sitting within a research-intensive university like this doesn't mean that they cannot coexist, and they should coexist.
Picking up Dennis's question, but also commenting on something that Ian said. Ian, I think you said you don't shy away from the fact that the university is a business. Well, I think I probably do shy away from it. It depends on what you mean by your terms, but I shy away from it. I think we have to behave in business-like ways in many respects. But fundamentally, a university, as distinct from, say, a for-profit higher education provider, to me has public purposes. The problem is you can't have every public purpose going, and these days we have to choose between the public purposes that we can pursue. I think that's the hard thing. But I see universities as fundamentally different kinds of organisations, certainly than for-profit businesses and from many others. And I think we need to hang on to that.
There was the example given of the ABC, and I can see parallels because our chief executive has to decide how much money, we need a 24-hour news channel with no extra money. And those cuts over there don't have anything to do with the fact that we've got a new 24-hour news channel. So how do you decide at a university that this field is going to get this much money and this one's going to get this much and research is going to get this much? How do you make those decisions? What are they based on?
I think what they will be based on in the future has to be the university's strategy, where it thinks it's going to fit in the world. Where we've made decisions in the past have been about the extent to which we reflect the relative funding model that the government allocates funding to internally. And by and large, those relativities have been reflected internally, but we've played around at the margins. So by and large, in the past, those decisions have been made by others and we just tweaked them. But in the future, they are about what kind of institution we think we're going to be, which public purposes are we going to pursue and which we can no longer pursue. And I think the real problem facing the sector is exiting from things. We're in so many things. We're spread thinly, and it's agony exiting from anything, but certainly some things more than others. But over time, we're going to have to do this.
It's very hard to answer your question in abstract, I think, Emma, but my sense is that in this period, what's happening in universities, not just in Australia, is that they're under tremendous pressure to lift their research performance. That's driven by a competitive framework that they're in, whereby they need to do better than each other in ranking. And there's a lot of downsides to that, diseconomies, if you like, that arise from that. But it also drives, it does drive performance and drives certain kinds of efficiencies. But there's also, I think, the widespread view in policy circles that innovation is a key to economic development long term, and universities are prime players, university research is prime in the innovation cycle. So building high research performance makes sense from that point of view. But there's also the factor that universities need to attract good quality international students, and they are attracted on the basis of university reputation because they don't know much about Australian universities before they come to Australia. And the thing that drives reputation above all is research performance as expressed in rankings and other measures. So there's also, I suppose, the intrinsic excitement of research itself. It's part of university culture. It's something that all of us get, I think, thoroughly engaged in and impressed by constantly by what our colleagues and others do. But, I mean, for all those reasons, universities are shifting as much of their resource base as they can into augmenting their short and long-term research performance because they need immediate results and they also need to establish capacity. And to be frank, that is bleeding teaching to some extent. I mean, it's an open secret that that Frank Larkin's University of Melbourne last year found that universities were actually spending on research about 1.5 billion more than they were being funded for research activity, indicating that they were cross-subsidising research from their international student income and from their domestic teaching resources as well. So there is a teaching research trade-off. The universities have been pushed towards research as their priority activity, and we're constantly fighting to get the quality back into teaching to ensure that larger classes aren't disadvantaging students' learning, to lift the quality of teacher preparation and the materials, the use of IT, all of that, to ensure that it doesn't get so out of whack that teaching really suffers from this. But there is, to be absolutely frank, competition is driving a focus on research which is out of whack, which is out of balance in terms of the teaching research mission within a very constrained funding envelope. With domestic student charges are fixed and the government subsidies fixed and the student contribution are fixed. So you can't get more resources into domestic teaching, and any subtraction from domestic teaching to sustain research really hurts the material base of our teaching system. So, I mean, this is a constraint which all of us feel. All of us are very concerned about what's happening with teaching, but all of us are stuck with the fact that we have to augment research.
And of course, the research that you're funding tends to be stuff that's going to lead to publication, which will lead to ranking. So research that is really translational or implementation stuff that might be in collaboration with industry sometimes does take a lower priority.
I reckon everyone grabs every opportunity they have. They can get to work with industry. That's my
that's certainly not our experience, you see.
Kate, I've heard industry say that many times. I don't agree. Let me take my own example.
Yeah.
I'm an engineer.
Yep.
I take textiles. As a researcher, I take every opportunity I can. I apply for ARC discovery grants. Yep. I apply for linkage grants. If industry wants to walk through the door and fund the work I do, I'll come on in. So I think our
industry
people
might have a view
that
that we want you to do the work that industry wants, not the other way around. That's where it goes a bit haywire.
I think there are examples. I mean, I've had examples with people who say that researchers who say, no, we just don't want to do that. That's not what we do. That's fine. But I think most people actually who are doing research in industry, which is true research, even if it's the research that the industry wants, actually find that there are spin-offs and multipliers for doing that.
I think that's very true.
And so that the really good, smart researchers can actually play it both ways. They can actually do what industry wants them to do, and they can actually use that to be able to develop their publication records as well.
Yeah. Two sides of the of the coin feed each other. You know, the industry work feeds the basic research feeds the industry work. I think that's how it works.
Yep, should.
We might just take one more question because I think we're almost coming out of time. Thomas Dubois, is he here?
Thank you. I'm unfortunately going to take a slightly different question as well. And it's very apropos to the discussion that's been going on for the past few minutes. And it's the question about branding, the brand of Australian tertiary education, whether it would be enhanced by the idea of a sort of super tier of universities, the one that everyone aspires to. And I think of this in particular in terms of international students. I just came from 9 years at the National University of Singapore, where they grow. There's a lot of talk of growing the brand of Singaporean education, Singaporean research, Singapore as a research center. But there's no question that the National University, as the National University, is going to be the flagship, and it will receive disproportionate resources and disproportionate attention. And the idea is that this is going to increase the soft power of Singaporean education as a brand, to attract the best and the brightest from Indonesia, from Thailand, what have you. And I wonder whether the National University of Australia, the ANU, should be thinking of positioning itself the same way, or if not necessarily the ANU, possibly the division between Melbourne, Sydney, for particular fields, whether there is a way of coordinating what Australian universities do to establish themselves as the place to go.
This is a very hot debate.
Now, Stephen put his hand up first.
All
Sorry.
right, there we
so we'll go to Stephen and we'll get everyone's perspective on this one.
There is a version of your question that I could agree with wholeheartedly, although I probably don't agree with it in the way that it was put and some of the implications that there are there. I agree with Simon in particular, his earlier comment that we need to have much more differentiated institutions. We're suffering from mimetic drift. We're all trying to become the same sort of thing. I don't know, a bit of Bologna, a bit of Berlin, and probably a bit of Boston as well. There's some model university that we're all trying to gravitate towards, and then we're trying to rank them from top to bottom. I think that's a silly thing to do. However, if we had a clearer sense of differentiated institutions, everyone is trying to be best in class, everyone is trying to be the best at what they do, and everyone is measured appropriately or is accountable for being the best of the kind of institution they are, then that I can agree with. Should there be in your words, super league? Well, I don't mind. Frankly, if you just merged a few group of eights, you'd get it. But they couldn't possibly bring themselves. Oh, my goodness me. But if you want a super league, just merge, I don't know, Monash and Melbourne. You'll get it. Stroke of a pen.
Let me have a right reply.
You've changed your mind.
No. I think I should speak first.
Yeah. Well, first of all, in terms of international branding, the answer to your question is yes. I mean, super institutions do that. Go to students around the world and ask them, which country would you like to study in? They almost always say the US. Why? Well, because the US has the top, 40 of the top 50 in the world, maybe more than that.
In some measures, yeah.
Even though they're going to study at the University of Kalamazoo, they don't care. US education must be good because of that halo effect. Australia doesn't have that halo effect. To come to the second part then, so you would obviously think that I'd say, yes, you should differentiate ANU. Well, historically that's happened, although the difference has fallen because the different funding has gradually died away for that, which actually did differentiate ANU. But I believe what you should do now is you should fund excellence, and you should fund it very well wherever it exists. And if you do that in Australia, then what will happen is that you will actually, if you had much more money, if you actually poured much more money into excellence, you would actually find that there would be a range of institutions would grow up because of that. But if you did that, then, if I use the University of Canberra as an example, then you would also find that there would be areas of excellence which would be able to develop in those institutions as well. And I think that's what you should do. You should fund excellence wherever excellence exists.
Okay. That's a very sensible diplomatic handling of the problem. And both contributions have been. I want to try and be more controversial. I mean, I think National University of Singapore is a fantastic institution. It's got the best global strategy in the world. What I look at mostly is global strategies. That's in my work. It really is. It really is the cutting edge. But the problem is very simple in Singapore. It's only 5 million people on the island. There's 2 major universities. There's 2 others now, but NUS has got a clear-cut role as the flagship. There's no debate about priorities or balancing distribution versus depth or any of those things.
Is that what you mean by strategy?
The Australian problem's a different problem. It's a larger country. Now, what we've done really well, if you look at things like research rankings, is we've established a large number of research-intensive universities in the world top 500. We've got on the best-known measure, the Shanghai Jiaotong ranking, which is based exclusively on research metrics. We've got 19 of the 500, which is, for a country of our size, about double the number we should have. And we have that in common with the Netherlands and Canada, and to some extent the UK, as systems where you've got a broad spread of research capacity. Now, that is a very good start for Australia in the knowledge economy period. It means we've got not only got strong research universities in every capital city, we've got them in some provincial centres like Townsville and Cairns, James Cook University as well. And we've got them in Hobart as well as having them in Sydney. That's a very good situation. It means that if we have the smart manufacturing sector in the future, we'll have the research expertise ready for it. It also means our government ought to be highly intelligent, highly well-informed, good at social design, because we have these resources in every urban centre. What we don't have is anyone in the top 50. Now, having strong global universities matters. It draws talent from all over the world. It draws attention from all over the world, which is what National University of Singapore does for Singapore as an island, as an economy. It means that there's a certain excitement around the urban precinct where that university is located. It means that a lot of industries will want to locate there because there's this pool of world-famous expertise. There's this famous brand, if you like, this intellectual brand in that centre. So global universities matter and we need them. I think ANU to some extent historically was our global university. As Ian said, the funding differentials faded, but in fact the capacity is still there in terms of raw research performance. When you look at ANU, it really does stand out. It's on a layer of its own in a lot of ways in the Australian context. But I think we need to support, as well as maintaining our 19 or plus research universities, and we need more than 19, and we might be able to push that number out to 25 or 30 if we could lift the capacity of a few more. At the same time, we need a layer of, I don't know how many, 4, 5, 6, 7 perhaps, if you look at world distributions of clusters of large, high-quality universities, maybe around 5 or 6 is the right number, but we need to extra fund those institutions to lift them to improve their global role. I don't think that would cost the other universities. That's my main argument. Having ANU as a strong university has not cost the rest of the system. It's lifted Australian research, it's lifted Australia's intellectual life, and it's given the other universities more of a funding argument, to be frank. And I think the same logic applies if you lift Sydney, Melbourne, Queensland, WA, maybe more, New South and so on. The same logic applies. If they get stronger, the others will not suffer. They only suffer if a government wants to run a zero-sum funding model where it has to be redistribution, and that's a great way of preventing anyone from getting any extra funding, running that kind of competitive political framework. But if we have a judicious approach long-term to investment in universities, we will build a super league and we will build more capacity and breadth as well.
Kate Carnell, do we have too many universities in Australia?
Look, I don't think we should say that. I think what we should say is that if we've got universities that aren't delivering, a really excellent outcome, we've got too many universities. I think
but given the funding constraints,
again,
should there be some consolidation perhaps?
I think that, looking at some consolidation in terms of centres of excellence is a good thing. There's no doubt about that. But I'm not sure that we have had a proliferation of universities over the last 30 years or so since we've got lots more universities. But as long as they're delivering an excellent outcome, that's absolutely fine. Once that changes, if the fight for more students means lowering standards, those sorts of things. If we get to that point, or if we are at that point, we've got a problem.
But if we're not in the top 50, is the answer that we need to refocus our resources into fewer, better, quality rather than quantity?
Well, it's always a mistake, I think, to stop doing things which are successful and important and valuable. I think we can find the resources to build more capacity at the top without bleeding the others. It really is within our reach to do that. It's a question of priorities, and the problem with higher education is the funding arguments are so tired, and we get exhausted by putting them continually. But there is an important private funding component in our universities. Half of their funding is essentially non-government funding, and we take every opportunity to build that sum, which includes extending our activities across a wide range of areas where we weren't active 30 years ago. But at the same, the other half, like every university system in the world, certainly the research-intensive universities crucially depend on government investment for research, and in most systems they depend on government investment in teaching as well. The issue there is that's no controversy about that fact. There's a strong correlation between the amount of money the government's put into R&D and the research and innovation outcomes everywhere in the world. The harder issues are how far do the dollars spread. We're a democratic country, and we think that the dollars should spread across the population, that all of our higher education should be good quality. That's where the problems of trade-off come in, because we're also running a low-tax environment, low-tax polity. So we're a democratic country where everyone's got entitlements, but we run a low-tax approach. That gets us into lots of trouble with welfare policy in other areas as well. It is, I think, a contradiction in our political culture. And that affects our capacity to sustain mass education at the level we need to sustain it. But there's no controversy about the need, I think, at a policy level to fund research properly.
We're taking one question from the floor.
Sure.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on a couple of comments that you made and sort of bring them together a little bit. First of all, we have our strength in agriculture and mining, and we have a short-term policy approach instead of long-term policies. And about Singapore national policies being the source of their success, Singapore's success. Now, clearly, we're falling down on the job. Instead of having these industries as the basis of our manufacturing, we seem to have a free-for-all and allowing our primary raw materials open as a free-for-all, just come and help yourself to it. So we're falling down on national policy there. It seems to be just too easy. Now, I've always assumed that universities have the responsibility to produce leaders in all fields, and particularly in government, and that means government policy. So I'll put it to you briefly. Have our universities failed in producing politicians who can't produce good policies, or have the universities failed in their role to implement or to get governments to adopt the right national policies, or both? And if so, what can universities do about it?
I think, Simon, that might be a good one for you.
This is a great question because it opens up so many things, and we're not going to be able to do it full justice. But I think, you will have seen the change in the public sector in the last 30 years, and you've seen the shift away from a kind of long-term vision in government, and that I think a lot of it is about the bureaucracy, about who's there, about the incentives to become a public servant, to want to serve the country in that way. We don't attract enough of our best people into government, into a lifetime commitment to public service as a principle. A lot of them go to universities now, I think, which is where they try to express that public service. But we're now in this hedged in with this more narrow framework where we're pursuing our institutions' interests half the time and our public interests the other half of the time, and that's not quite the same. I think government is the key site, and this is where I respect greatly Singapore and China and Korea and places like that where the best and brightest go to government. not necessarily to law or medicine.
Not all lawyers.
Or business, but they go to government because it's regarded as the best thing for someone to do who's from a strong educational background, who achieves well at university. So we need to look to the public service, I think, as a place where we might try to rebuild the values that we're committed to. And universities, I think, have got a major role to play in training the next generation of public servants in the sorts of long-term views and social values that we need to have.
Ian?
Yeah. This is too good an opportunity to let go past. Of course, you're here this evening in the Crawford School of Public Policy. And so it couldn't be something which was more appropriate to ask. And in fact, whereas, and I know this is the case, Simon was talking about earlier that the best and brightest from University of Melbourne go into industry, not into government. In the case of ANU, that's not true. I mean, if you look at the graduates from ANU, partly because of the fact that we're here in the national capital, students actually come here in many cases because they actually want a career in the public service or indeed in politics. And indeed, you find that many of our graduates go into exactly these areas. And from the point of view of ANU, strategically, our strategic plan has 3 core planks. 2 of them are obvious, research and education. And the third one is we want to be seen as being a centre for public policy. We want to be able to influence government. We want to be able to produce the people that will influence government. We want to be a resource for government that they can call on. So we see that it's a really critically important part of this institution, and I think one of the very few opportunities for a university to be able to differentiate itself.
So, as I understand the logic of that, the ANU's to blame for the mess that was...
We're going to fix
Moving
it,
right
we're
along,
going to fix it in the future.
I think basically my answer to your question is probably yes, or yes to a significant extent. I think probably universities haven't conspicuously thought of themselves as producing leaders with responsibility, and that's something that I think we should get back on track with. I think universities probably haven't engaged in public controversies of the day for all kinds of reasons, and I think we probably have missed opportunities to put other long-term views which could prevail over short-term political priorities. So I've got a lot of sympathy with the question you asked, actually.
Look, I do too, from the politician in the midst, but or at least ex-one. I think it's really true, but I think there's a bit of an argument to suggest that where universities do get involved in public policy, it doesn't tend to be very balanced. There would be an argument that balanced public policy that isn't tending towards to probably more left-wing public policy has been a real issue in the space. So good public policy is balanced public policy, and that's been a challenge.
Yeah, but the problem is that our public discussion space is corrupted by a high level of intensive politicisation. I mean, a lot of very balanced stuff on climate change gets reinterpreted as partisan and kicked around in the public space in a very destructive way. I don't think that frightens people off from making comment. I mean, I think that there are more publicly active scientists and academics now than there ever have been, but it filters and distorts what they're saying, and it means the messages aren't being heard, but the symbolic politics of their comment becomes dominant. I mean, I think also when we talk about public service, we need to acknowledge that the public service has been politicised in a destructive way in some respects, because the senior executive service is beholden to its immediate political masters, that people don't have continuity of employment between governments. This is different to many other public services in the world. I think that kind of desire of government to have operational control over the public service, so that it can be used to service electoral rather than policy objectives, is a crucial problem. I don't know how you undo those kinds of things. I think we could start to undo the corruption of the public discussion by opening up more media outlets, by making more use of the internet and other non-conventional media forums, by perhaps establishing different codes of conduct with reporting. I mean, all those sorts of things can contribute, I think, to opening up a public discussion. The politicisation of the public service is something that's quite difficult to unwind.
And, oh dear, more questions. Do we have time for more questions? I think maybe just one more. We are already over time. Yes, the lady in the back there.
My question is, for Professor Yang and the Vice Chancellor of the ANU. I'm an alumni of the ANU, and according to the professor just now mentioned that ANU has produced many leaders or many successful leaders in many fields. But in my opinion, probably ANU has not done enough in contributing to the success of these leaders. Probably when these students go to other universities, such as Melbourne University and University of Canberra, and at the end of the day, they will also be successful. So, yes, so I don't think the university has done enough to customize these potential talents. I think as a graduate of ANU, I feel like it's like a product line. I don't feel that I myself is valued by the university, and I don't have any customized service gained from the university that can match my potential and needs and my future goals as a personal success. Yeah, and also in terms of failure to attract the best international students, besides the lack of fund, I think, and support in money incentives, yes, I think the weak in the education, it's also a weak point of ANU. We know that ANU is strong in research, but how much that can the students benefit from the research, and what can we do to strengthen the links between the research results to transfer this research to the knowledge or wealth of the students in future? And this link, I think, is ANU should be strengthened on, and we need to really the customized service we need.
Can I, well, first, the answer to the first question, and this comes back to, I think, the question earlier about, Emma, do we have too many universities? Well, I don't think we have enough, actually. At least we don't have enough tertiary education institutions, because Australian universities are large. By world standards, they are very large. And what that, of course, means is you don't have, Australia doesn't have a university that has 5,000 students. There are plenty of those in the US. And of course, that's where you get a personal education. It's very difficult to do that, irrespective of the quality of education. It's very difficult to do that when you're talking about 20, 30,000 students. So I think that's the challenge. And because Australia has very large institutions, and again, the funding system has driven us to have very large institutions, it's very difficult to get a personal education when there's 20,000 students. The second one you said is something which I actually deeply believe in, and that is an institution like this, what we should be able to do, and I actually believe that there's an advantage in having researchers involved in education. Now, the data actually it's hard to be able to quantify that, but as somebody who has both done research and taught many, many times, I actually think there's a real advantage in having those put together. I have to say, we're still debating internally what this sort of research-led education really means and how you really get an advantage from it. But it's something which I think, particularly all the research-intensive universities in Australia believe in and actually try to develop. And I think there's a number of ways of cutting it in terms of developing research skills for our students, which will be important for them, actually being able to attract the best people to be able to teach them. So I think having research in universities really does pay off. Have we done it as well as we could? Absolutely not.
And I think that's not a bad point at which to wind things up. Thank you all very much for being here, and I hope it's been valuable for all of you. It's certainly taught me a lot. Thanks very much to the panellists.